All right, yes, perfect. So first of all, what did we go over in the previous video? We went again over those protected highs, protected lows, a very simple manner on how we can know, all right, what is order flow currently doing, where does price have no reason to come back, because that would be our entry. And if we constantly do that, then eventually we can get to 1 minute time frame entries, etc., stuff like that. So right now, I want to go over the entry types. This is probably one of the easiest videos you are going to have right here, because it's just a matter of choice. So what do I mean by that? Let's go over Euro US dollar right here. We've gone over this a couple of times, but one more time right here. Overtaken the monthly fair value gap. Perfect. So right now, do we have context that we can trade off of to look to continue higher? Weekly, not yet. Daily, do we have some type of context? Yes, we have this context in the form of that daily fair value gap. Perfect. That creates also this target right there. All right, very nice. So right there, daily fair value gap is where we want to trade off of. And we have now refined the area that the price can continue higher off as well, because we know it should not reach below this low. And this fair value gap already is quite big, so it should not reach below that as well. Perfect. So once we know that, then let's dive into the 15-minute time frame right there to see what our entry type would be. First off, we need to understand that with entry type, I don't necessarily mean an ST plus a RE, etc. I mean, where are you actually going to enter off of? That is what I'm aiming at. So what are you actually going to enter off of? Which PD array are you going to enter off of? That is important to understand. We are going to use this through our float and our lot and our odd concept. So that is first line of defense, last line of defense, and the overlapping defense. That is what we're going to be using in this case. What would that look like? So if we want to enter off the 15-minute, then again, we need first off a 15-minute ST. 15-minute ST happens right there. Then after that ST, we also have the 15-minute RE. So once we get that 15-minute RE that is sitting right there, that RE, that fair value gap, after that fair value gap is being formed. So after this candle right there, in this moment in time, we can now look to enter, because this RE has officially formed, because that candle has closed and created the fair value gap. What do you enter on? There is different types of entries right here. And this is just simply where you choose. You just choose. And the way I want you to see this as well, this is purely about picking your poison. And what I mean by that is sometimes it doesn't stay into the fair value gap. Sometimes it doesn't come into the overlapping part. Sometimes it sweeps the low. So whatever you choose right there, it has pros and cons. There's not necessarily one better than the other. I just need you currently to stick to one. Choose one and stick to one. Because eventually you will also see me that I sometimes enter off the float, off the odd, sometimes I enter off of this. And that is because the experience has taken over. So eventually that can take over. But first we need to have guidelines. If we don't have guidelines, we will get lost in the lower time frame and we will get lost in price action. So we first need to have those guidelines once we have enough experience. And I'm talking about a year of in a profitable state, and you are doing absolutely amazing. That is also when you will slowly start to transition. All right, I think I can now enter off of this. I think I can now enter off of this, etc. That is what will slowly transition to. But first, for the first year, I would argue, is we only stick to one entry. And that is why the entry types here is pretty easy to understand, because it's just simply choosing the float, the odd, or the lot. So in this case, what I mainly use is I use the float. So I always enter off the first line of defense. That usually is a fair value gap right there, but doesn't have to always be a fair value gap. It's also examples what we're going to go over. So here, what I would use is, all right, the float, because the float is just that fair value gap. So the sting in that fair value gap right there would be our entry. Now, that is again just simply following the float, the odd, or the lot concept, because the odd, the overlapping defense, would be this right there, which we can also use, but it's again that picking your poison, right? You have the highest chance of getting involved on the flood because it's the first line of defense. So if we come into anything, then we're going to come into that first. So it's the highest chance of getting involved, which is nice. But there is a difference because this is what we're going to touch on very in depth in risk management as well. Because we can always choose the flood for sure. But I would argue that if you get involved on the odd right there, you have first off a way better entry, so a more so refined RR, which your take profit would likely already be hit a little bit earlier. And it also allows you to have a better risk management because you have less points, less pips in drawdown, less price action in drawdown, which means that you can have a very accurate entry actually, which allows you to go break even very early, which allows you to hit take profit earlier as well. So if you like that, which I could definitely see why people would like that 100%, then I would say go for the overlapping defense. But that comes at the consequence that you will miss some moves, potentially. Now, this is also where eventually we can play with different types of risk. Because let's say if we risk 1%, we always risk 1%. That's just me saying something again. That is not, don't always risk 1%. Don't get me wrong. But let's say a person always risks 1% right there. And he is looking to enter off the flood and the odd. Then what would you do? You would risk 0.5% right there to at least get involved and to at least not miss the move. And then the rest of the percentage, so the 0.5%, would go on to the overlapping defense right there. If you get that great entry, then you also have a picture perfect entry right there. So you at least can capitalize on the move with the original risk that you already had, 1%. So that is eventually also what we can do. But first, I would advise, let's get familiar with just one entry. So with just a singular entry that we can stick to over and over and over. So here, this would be the flood for me right there. That for me would be the flood. But if you want to choose the odd, then that again is perfectly fine. And eventually again, I just need to remind you of this as well, is that it is fine if you are not, if you don't really like it, or during your trading and you're like, I don't really like this, I want to adjust it, etc. That's fine. As long as we don't throw away the whole core of the trading plan. That is very important. So if you notice, I always ended off odd, but right now I'm just missing all the moves, etc. So I just want to try out flood. Yes, we can do that. Make sure you're not switching around constantly. So at least give it some time. At least give it enough trades. I would say a minimum of 10 trades each to then potentially say, all right, let me try this one. And make sure the core of the strategy always stays the same. So within the strategy here, you are changing something, which isn't the biggest thing because the outcome will likely be the same thing. But it is very important that we are now not incorporating other things and we're switching around with everything, because that is where the shiny object syndrome will come in, of course. That is extremely important. All right, so this is basically your entry types. Now, you can, of course, also use the odd, which I would not advise to use right there, especially not if you're entering off an overflow leg, then this would not something you would want to use right there. Definitely not. So let's say we did have already an overflow leg higher and we got another overflow leg higher without a fair value gap higher, so without an actual overflow leg, for example, a leg like this where we don't have fair value gap higher, but we do have this low right there, then that is of course a weak swing low. So that in itself, if order flow is already confirmed, which it isn't right there, that itself could also be an entry. Where do you cover your stop loss? Again, that is all coming in risk management as well. So here, what do we actually do? Because right now, what would you do if we want to follow price action? So if we want to take another entry, we can take another entry. It's just that the more we wait, the more difficult it is going to become. And the reason why that is because the more we wait, the more time we are giving to the time frames above us to create fair value gaps as well. So to make it easy, because it doesn't have to be difficult, is just create the habit of consistently and on a constant basis zoom out again. What fair value gaps are you creating? Because here, all you would do is, if you are entering off the flood, it would be this breaker right there. That breaker. If you want to enter off of the overlapping part, then it would be this fair value gap right there. So that is how you can play around with it as well. And this is how you can take another entry to then target again the highs. It's just important that another entry can be on the same time frame here. Because as we can see, the 15 minute has the same context in this moment as the 1 hour. So it's basically the same entry. Only thing is again, if we follow along with the 15-minute price action right here, then we need to start taking into account the 1 hour, etc. Because we need to know what the 1 hour is doing in order for us to have good 15-minute entries. And that is exactly what we talked about in the previous video, where if we want to look for new entries, then we need to know, all right, what is the 1 hour doing? Because if we have a 1 or 15-minute order flow lag, for example, this 15-minute order flow lag, and there's a 1 hour fair value gap below it, then this 15-minute order flow lag, again, is not high probability of holding. So that is what we need to understand, where we have the same thing. This 15-minute order flow lag is actually the high of a fair value gap, of a 1 hour fair value gap. So this 15-minute order flow lag might seem high probability right there, but it simply isn't, because we have a 1 hour fair value gap sitting right there. That is very important. So these are the entry types. Now, of course, we'll go over more examples right now. So let's go into the next example, but it's mainly understanding, again, it's quite simple, as in this is probably one of the easiest videos that we will have in the mentorship. Might also be quite refreshing, I reckon. But yeah, it's simply the flood, the odd, and the lot. Although, if you do not understand the previous concept, then I can understand on why this might be a little bit more difficult. Here we again have the same context, right? We had that unusual context on the weekly that creates the potential usual context. On the daily, we followed through, create this unusual context right there without following through. On the 4 hour, no context yet. On the 1 hour, we created this context with that fair value gap sitting right there. Perfect. So we can continue lower off of that. All right, that creates the boundary again. What is the target in the meantime? The target, the context low, is that. So that exact area, again, this area is where we want to look for entries. Nothing more than that, unless we create new context after that as well. So if we go into the 1 minute time frame and we just simply use this concept again. We have this ST. Again, remember, this was an ugly ST. An ugly ST right there. Then we have the first fair value gap, second fair value gap lower right there. And then what would be your entry? If it's the flood in this moment, then we could make the argument that it's actually this right there. What does that mean? That means that once that fair value gap is created, you can already enter. This is what you will see if you go through my trade recaps, etc. This is what you'll see me do sometimes, where I enter off the creation of a fair value gap. Because all I'm waiting for right there is I'm waiting for another fair value gap to be created. Because that confirms order flow. When does that fair value gap get created? Right there. That gets created at this candle close. So let me actually point towards it. That candle close right there. That is where order flow is now confirmed bearish. So we can continue lower. The entry pattern is there with the ST plus the RE. So here at this moment in time, you could look to enter off the creation of the fair value gap already, or enter off the flood right there. And the reason for that is because there's not a guarantee that we will come into the fair value gap right there, because there's a defense withholding price from potentially coming into the fair value gap right there, which then would become a fair value gap, also known as a breakaway gap, that is left alone, as in it is not traded back into, which could happen, which sometimes we will also see happen. So here when I do this, and we'll get into the specifics of it, but when I enter of the creation of a fair value gap or of the flood concept instead of the fair value gap, I want to see if the RR is worth it. What does that mean? The way I define that is if we can target a 1 to 2 RR within the original context, then I'm perfectly fine with entering of the creation of the fair value gap. What does that mean? Well, right here on the 5 minutes, we, of course, like we saw last time, we needed to take into account this 5 minutes fair value gap above it as well. All right, so I covered the body right there. I covered the body of those highs. So the context on the 1 hour was originally right here, was from this fair value gap towards that low right there. Can we get a 1 to 2 inside that context already? Because that leads me back to understanding the probabilities, right? The highest probability is getting a rejection. The next probability is getting that entry pattern. The next probability is getting that entry pattern that actually plays out. So it's actually a winner. The next probability is getting that take profit hit. So it's actually that 1 to 2 inside that context hit. The lowest probability within the highest probability was what? That was that we actually follow through. So if my 1 to 2 is right there, then yes, that is still high probability of playing out. But it is lower probability of playing out than having my 1 to 2 inside the context right there. So here, my 1 to 2 is below those lows. This is generally something I do not like, because then my day trade or my scalp right there almost turns into a swing trade, where right there we can also experience more drawdown, etc. This is not something I personally would like, because it also then comes back to it's going to be more difficult to go break even, which are all things I generally do not really like. But again, eventually, if you do like it, then this, of course, also plays out perfectly. So right there, this trade ID is ideally where I would want to enter a little bit higher. Why is that? Because that allows me to eventually get the context within the 1 to 2 within the context if we just enter off the overlapping part right there, and we can potentially in the next video refine our stop loss even more. So that is all things that we are going to get into as well. But that is the thought process behind that, where you would not really expect sometimes the fair value gap to be traded into, which again, with time, we're getting more into as well, because the flood could be holding price back from trading into that fair value gap right there. All right, so then the next entry type is GU, which we also, of course, went over in the previous video. So let's go towards it. Let me, on the daily time frame, it was this price action right here, where we had the monthly fair value gap, of course, and then we had the daily ST of that monthly fair value gap, which we can continue lower off of, right there. And daily ST, inside the daily ST, I wanted to see a 1 hour ST. So of that 1 hour ST right there, what would the entry be here? Well, this is a little bit more difficult, because this lag, as you can see, is quite long. And quite long relatively seen to what? Quite long relatively seen to the overall daily context, because the daily context is this daily fair value gap towards the previous day low sitting right there. So yes, if you're using the flood concept, this would be the entry right there. That would be the entry covering maybe the bodies, but overall covering that high. So the 1 to 2 would require quite a bit of price action to actually reach that. As in, look at all the price action we need below that context low. That is relying on price creating now a whole new daily fair value gap. That is, of course, the lowest probability inside that high probability of actually playing out. So right here, what I also did at that moment in time is, all right, here I just want to simply wait a little bit longer, and potentially if I get something nice right there, then that would be my entry. On the overlapping part, I would like that as well, to then avoid being stuck in this break-even cycle as well. Because here, would you be break-even? Well, based on order flow, and to give you some insights here, would you be break even based on order flow alone? No, because we never create a new vervagap lower of those previous vervagaps. So there's always a reason to return, which is why it's more difficult to go break even when you have an inaccurate entry. Where here, is there really a reason to come back right there? No, there's not. So here you can go break even quite fast when you already create those vervagaps lower right there. And this would also allow you to have that 1 to 2 a little bit earlier right there. So the float, the odd, depends on the overall context. As in, it depends on the current situation. And that is usually, and that's what I'm trying to work towards as well slowly, that we get you to see the different situations. So at first, let's try to make it mechanical. At first, just simply enter off the float or the odd. Choose one, pick your poison in that sense. Eventually, I'm trying to transition, and that is what I'm trying to show you here. I'm trying to transition you towards seeing the different opportunities right there that we have and seeing how we can read the pros and the cons. So again, the arguments, where the arguments would be in favor right now of actually just entering off the overlapping defense instead of using the first line of defense. Even though this is of course the argument that we're actually in the trade, well, actually being in the trade is of course only beneficial if we actually are going to hit take profit. Otherwise, it's just a headache. So that is what we also need to consider in this moment, where being in the trade right there, yes, that is great, but if we can use that overlapping defense, then of course that is also what we would like to aim for overall. With the overlapping defense, could as well be right there at that moment in time. So that is exactly what I'm trying to transition towards slowly, where we can read the price action currently. That would be very, very nice. So the next example is Canadian dollar CHF again. So let's go towards it. Then we, of course, have the same exact thing that we talked about in the previous videos. Let me remove that. That we have the weekly vervagap and we had the monthly. So the monthly is following through right there. Creates unusual context as well. Weekly creates that usual context right here. All right, interesting. So now the protected high is that high. We understand that. So somewhere there we are going lower. All right, we have this weekly vervagap right there. Well, we can continue lower off of that. Perfect. So what do we see? We can go into the 1 hour to find our 1 hour ST plus RE. So right here, weekly context sitting right there. Then here, we have the 1 hour ST. All right, we wait still. We wait a little bit. After that, we create this 1 hour RE. That 1 hour RE right there did not, that vervagap did not have a sting into it. So here, this is what I mean with, all right, if you were to always enter off a vervagap, for example, then that would not allow you to get involved. So if you were to use the float instead of the odd right there, then that would have gotten you involved. Because then the entry would have been off of that low to then target lower eventually as well. Covering that high potentially to then target that 1 to 2. That would have been really nice. So that is again picking your poison, and eventually slowly, if you understand the concepts and you know how to navigate them, you're getting a little bit more confident, a little bit more at ease with the concepts as well. That is when we can look to, all right, let's see if we can now switch it up between our entry patterns. So the reason why I do not want to start off with that and why I would rather have you choosing one. So choose either the float or the odd. Choose the first line of defense or the overlapping defense. The reason why I would want you to do that first is because executing is where the emotions come into play, which is psychology, which is extremely important. Because if we have emotions into play and we're about to execute, then it's like, oh shit, what do I do now? Do I enter here? Do I enter there? What do I do? And usually in the moment, in that heat of the moment, you're going to choose the wrong one because that's just human nature, and that is of course what we don't want to do. So when we get used to that heat of the moment and you don't really feel that heat of the moment, and believe me, that feeling does go away. It's always going to be there a little bit, but you're able to control it more and you're able to see it coming, and you're like, okay, here it is again, the heat of the moment. welcome, hello, my old friend. And here we go again. And you can still think clearly. And when your thinking is cluttered with emotions, so what's that look like? I always like to use the analogy of having a boiling pan, right? Where we have boiling water. You can't see clearly in the water, but only when it calms down right there, then you can see clearly again. So that's the same with if we are heated and the heat of the moment, then we can't think clearly. So we need to first calm down again to then think clearly. In the beginning, you're just simply not going to be able to calm down very easily. So that is when we just need to have a checklist where we need to have that discipline to stick to the checklist, and then everything will still be all right. Eventually, once we get used to that heat of the moment, we can, of course, be better traders overall, because then we can read price action purely for what it is. And when you can read price action purely for what it is, be objective around it, still in a subjective mindset, that is when your potential gets unlocked. That is exactly when experience, when intuition kicks in, when your win rate increases, not because your trading plan is better mechanically. This is when you are an elite trader. And that is when usually people always see is, again, that is not when the concepts are doing great, it's when you are doing great. So that is mostly what it's about in trading as well. And that is slowly where we are trying to get to, of course. So here, first, if you can't take that heat of the moment, then I would say, all right, choose either the float or the odd and religiously every single trade, stick to it. After a while, once you are used to also taking hits, once you are used to thinking in that heat of the moment, then we can use logic more so, where right there, we can just use the float instead of the odd, because here you would not really expect a retracement into the value gap because it's also not part of the float. So that is very important to understand as well. So if we go into the last example that we had, of course, on the same pair with this right there. And again, everything that I'm showing right here is on Forex, but indices is the exact same thing. And we're going to go over indices as well more in depth. So if we go into the 1 minute time frame, let me find the price action right there that I wanted to show. Then on the 1 minute time frame, what would that look like? On the 1 minute time frame, we of course need to wait for our ST plus our RE. That is sitting right there, our ST, and we create a new RE lower off of that. If you were to enter off the float, then it would actually be this right there. But you could argue, you could make the argument actually, it would be that order block. That order block sitting right there, because that is also where the fair value gap gets created. So we could enter off that float right there. If you were to follow the fair value gaps lower and you were to consistently want to enter off fair value gaps alone, then it would be this entry right there. So that is how we go about that. And then the odd would be something like we have these lows to the left right there, and we even have this actually, these lows right there, enter off of that. That would be your overlapping defense right there. So that is again picking your poison, where if you went to where to enter here, it might take you a little bit longer to take profit overall. Where if you enter right there, it would probably take you less time, of course, to enter overall. But if you do enter lower right there, then you did get an extra confirmation. So you did get another fair value gap lower, which means that overall you have more confluences going for that trade. So you have more arguments going for the trade as well. So that could be a higher probability of playing out as well. So that is all picking your poison, where it would be purely, all right, where do I want to enter on and what poison do I essentially want to pick right there? Am I really bad at risk management? As in, I am just not good at risk management and I don't want to deal with it as well. I just want to get great entries and I just want to essentially leave my monitor, leave my screen and just go do something else. Perfect. Then the overlapping defense is something for you. Then right here, you would want to get the most accurate entry always. So right here, this would, for example, be a great entry for you, the overlapping defense. Once we come back into that, and then cover the high, because then you get very accurate entries. Are you willing to just be in a trade and just whatever it takes, just be in the trade? And risk management is not your biggest concern. I don't really care about it. I have enough time as well to look at a chart potentially to see if my risk management is in play. Perfect. Then why not go for the first line of defense right there? So those are questions that we need to consider in order for you to see, all right, which one do you want to trade? Do you want to trade the overlapping defense or the first line of defense? And that is, again, what we're going to touch on in the next video as well with risk management, where do you purely want to have a very early entry because you do not want to focus on risk management a lot? Great. Let's find the overlapping defense, or let's find how we can get involved early. Do you want to, do you actually want to focus on risk management and you don't really mind, you just want to be a part of the move? Great. Then we can focus on that first line of defense, or for example, this right there, this entry right there, which means as well, of course, there's pros and cons to it. There's picking your poison, like we mentioned, because here on the 5 minute, if you were to enter off the 5 minute ST and you need a retracement into the fair value gap, and for example, this would be your entry right there. But what are you going to cover right there? That's a little bit more difficult, right? Then you would cover this, then it turns almost into a swing trade. Where if, for example, you wanted to get in very early, then do we have a small fair value gap actually there? We do not have that. Then that if we did create that fair value gap higher right there, which I believe was on GU at that moment. So let me show you the right example. Sorry, it was on EU. It was the 1 hour example right there. Then that would be right there. If you were to enter off of very early, then you could have entered off of this right there, the creation of that fair value gap as well, which allows you to have a greater RR overall. So again, there's pros and cons to it. If you want to always enter off the overlapping defense, then we can see, all right, you likely don't want to have that risk management, or you do want to have the risk management, of course, but you just like the overlapping defense and the things that come with it. Perfectly fine. If you understand as well that we might not always come into the overlapping defense. If you want to use the flood, then again, you're perfectly fine, most likely with the risk management, or you just always like to enter off the flood and you don't really mind. Then that also comes at the risk that the risk management will likely be a little bit more difficult. So going break even will be a little bit more difficult, etc. I do not need you to fully understand this concept currently, and do not need you to make a choice right now. Eventually, once the enrollment is over and we can slowly look to start trading, no financial advice, then that will become a lot clearer as well. This is just, again, the basics of entry types. And then in the next video, we are going to touch on risk management. And it's also important to understand, of course, this is not the end. As in, it's not you're going to choose flat or odd and stick to it for the rest of your life. No, we are looking, with the time you being in a mentorship or not even being in a mentorship, we're slowly looking to transition you to being the trader that can differentiate in that moment in time. Do I want to enter off the odd or the flat? What is the best option right here? That is what we're slowly getting towards. So what is the best option right here? Can we enter off the odd or the flat? That is what we will be looking at. So try to see this and try to find some examples in context with that entry pattern, with that entry type. And then from there, we can slowly start working as well. Perfect. Thank you.